Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more, save Jesus only, for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that ever lived in it. I took these words to heart during the time I believed in the truth claims of the Mormon Church. I believed the narrative about Joseph Smith restoring the fullness of the gospel to the earth. I believed that because of the restored gospel, I would have the opportunity to become exalted and live with my family for eternity, and eventually become deified. However, as my beliefs started to collapse, I held tighter and tighter to some of the core concepts, until they too fell through my fingers. One of those was the resurrection, and though it isn't taught explicitly by the church, it was my understanding through implied teachings over the years that Joseph Smith had been resurrected, so he could continue his important work. Now, I know it wasn't a great assumption, but it is a logical extension of several church teachings. So you can imagine my surprise when I came upon an article describing the exhumation of the skeletons of Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum in 1928. Welcome, friends, enemies, and everyone in between, to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am in fact the Masked Mormon.
Why you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
Let's get into it. Joseph Smith founded, organized, and led the Mormon Church until his death at the hands of an angry mob on June 27, 1844, at roughly 5:16 p.m., when he was 38 years old. Joseph was the mayor of Nauvoo, Illinois, and ordered the destruction of a printing press that had printed a newspaper exposing his practice of polygamy. The public outcry at this action resulted in arrest warrants for Joseph. He initially tried to evade capture, but traveled to the county seat in Carthage, Illinois, with his brother Hyrum to face the charges. He had, to this point in his life, been able to avoid most of his legal run-ins. After surrendering with Hyrum, they were detained in Carthage jail. As they were awaiting trial, an angry mob stormed the jail and murdered Hyrum and Joseph. During the fray, Joseph, Hyrum, and a few other church leaders tried to hold off the mob in the upper room of the jailhouse. Joseph had been previously supplied with a pistol that had been smuggled to him, which he discharged into the mob, injuring 2 or 3 of the assailants. As Hyrum was trying to hold the door, one of the attackers shot through it, striking him on the left side of the face, near the nose. He fell back dead. Joseph, who was a Freemason, tried running to the window in a last-ditch effort to call for help from any other Freemasons that might have been in the crowd. He was midway through uttering a Freemason's distress call when he was struck by several shots, possibly coming from the door and through the window from the ground below. He fell out of that window, and he may have been dead by the time he hit the ground, but there are other reports that suggest that he may have still been alive. Members of the mob then propped him up against a wall and shot him in a firing squad fashion before they eventually ran off. After they were murdered, the bodies of Joseph and Hyrum were taken back to Nauvoo, where a public viewing occurred. I didn't know much of what happened afterwards. I trusted the church's eulogizing of Joseph and Hyrum that is contained in Doctrine and Covenants 135, and the mythologizing of the events that occurred over the centuries. Joseph is praised through church propaganda such as films, tours of historical sites, and hymns that are sung in church like Praise to the Man. It's taught that Joseph is continuing the work of the restoration beyond the veil of death and preparing the world for the second coming of Jesus. Though it isn't officially taught at church, it was heavily implied during my high school and college years that Joseph Smith would have been resurrected in order to continue his work on behalf of mankind. I still held on to this hope as my faith started to unravel, because I figured if Joseph Smith was resurrected, then there was still hope that perhaps the gospel that was restored through Joseph was true. There are Mormon legends that are running around the church zeitgeist. These stories often come from journals or lore that has been passed on over the generations. Some of these stories include things like Zelf, or something like Satan controlling the waters. But one in particular that stuck out to me for a long time is the story that was allegedly recorded by Ezekiel Johnson, who went by Zeke, who lived from 1869 to 1957. In 1954, a few years before his death, when he was 85, he recounted the story about a miraculous resurrection of a little girl. Quoting from this journal, he said, quote, "I have been requested to relate an experience I had in 1908 to 1909 in Blanding County, Utah. I was just making a home in Blanding, and the whole county was covered with trees and sagebrush. I was working hard to clear the ground to plant a few acres of corn. We had 5 acres ready and had started to plant the corn. My little boy Roy, 7 or 8 years old, was there to help me plant. While I was plowing on that piece of ground, I discovered there were ancient houses there, or the ruins of them. As I was plowing around, I noticed that my plow had turned out the skeleton of a small child. Most of the bones, of course, were decayed and gone. Part of the skeleton was there, so I stopped immediately as the plow had passed it a little. I turned and looked back against the bar of the plow between the handles. As I was looking at the little skeleton that I had plowed out, all of a sudden, to my surprise, I saw the bones wiggle, and they began to change position, and to take on a different color. Within minutes, there lay a beautiful little skeleton. There I saw the inner parts of the natural body coming in, the entrails, etc. I saw the flesh come on, and I saw skin come on to the body. When the inner parts of the body were complete, a beautiful head of hair adorned the top of the head, and in about half a minute after the hair was on the head, it had a beautiful crystal decoration in the hair. It was combined beautifully and parted on one side. In about half a minute more, the child raised upon her feet. She was lying a little on her left side with her back towards me. As she raised up, a beautiful robe came down over her left shoulder, and I saw it must be a girl. She looked at me, and I looked at her for a quarter of a minute. We just looked at each other, smiling. Then, in my desire to get a hold of her, I said, "Oh, you beautiful child," and I reached out as if I would embrace her, and she disappeared. That was all I saw. End quote. Now Zeke reflected on this story and wondered why he was permitted to see it, and apparently, under the influence of the Spirit, it was revealed to him. He says, quote, "When the child was buried there, it was either in time when the ground was frozen and they had no tools to dig deep graves. If it were during the time of war, they wouldn't possibly take time to dig a deep grave. They just planted that little body as deep as they could under the circumstances. When it was done, the sorrowing mother knew that it was such a little shallow grave that in her sorrows she cried out to the little group that was present, 'That little shallow grave, the first beast that comes along will smell her body and dig her up, and will scatter her to the 4 winds. Her bones will be scattered all over these flats.' There just happened to be a man present holding the priesthood, a Nephite or a Jaredite, I don't know which, because there had been both in this country. This man said, 'Sister, calm your sorrows. Whenever that little body is disturbed or uncovered, the Lord will call her up and she will live.'" Unquote. Now I found this story with all of its details very faith-affirming. And like most miraculous stories, there really isn't anything that can substantiate it. Now I will do a video on the problems with miracles at a later date. But I thought of this story when considering the internment of Joseph and his brother. But then I visited Nauvoo and saw the graves of Hyrum, Joseph, and his first wife, Emma. And I also happened onto an article that was published in 2009 relating the results of a forensic study on the remains of Hyrum and Joseph. My reasoning was if Joseph and Hyrum had been resurrected, there would be no remains to be found. Though these things didn't totally obliterate my faith, it did help it collapse a little further. But this story is still very fascinating. So that's kind of what happened to Joseph and Hyrum after they were brought back to Nauvoo. But before we continue on, if you like what I do, please press the like button and subscribe, and even leave a comment. I read them all and try to respond to as many as I can. The article I mentioned is titled Skulls and Crossbones, a forensic study of the remains of Hyrum and Joseph Smith by Curtis G. Weber. After the murder of Hyrum and Joseph and their public viewing, their bodies were hid in a room of the mansion house in Nauvoo, while sandbag-filled coffins were used for the public burial. Under the cover of darkness, later that night, a small group of men carried the coffins containing the actual bodies and buried them in the basement of the unfinished hotel, the Nauvoo House. There they remained for a few months. Joseph's first wife, Emma, had the bodies removed and reinterred on the Smith property. This was done so Emma could maintain control over the disposition of her husband's body. As the Mormons were preparing their exodus to Utah, Emma was afraid Brigham Young might try to take control of the bodies. Apparently, the bodies were then dug up again and hidden at a farm for a short time until the threat was gone, after which they were returned to the Smith property. After the death of Emma, the exact location of the graves was practically lost. Only the general location of the gravesite was known among Joseph Smith's descendants. However, in 1913, when the Keokuk Dam was completed, the waters of the Mississippi River began to rise, threatening to encroach onto the property. The RLDS Church, who owned the land, were concerned that the graves of Hyrum and Joseph would be submerged. So then, in 1928, a small crew was hired to search for the remains of Joseph and Hyrum. On the third day, they unearthed Emma's remains. 3 days later, they unearthed the floor of a lost outbuilding, and under the floor of this ruined building, they unearthed a skull, which was presumably that of Hyrum. A few minutes later, another skull was unearthed, presumably to be Joseph's. The remains were taken to the upper room of the mansion house, where they were photographed and measured. The face of the second skull had largely collapsed, but the rest could be compared to phrenology measurements that Joseph had taken of his head when he was alive. The next day, the remains of Emma, Joseph, and Hyrum were reinterred side by side at a newly prepared gravesite. This is the gravesite that you can visit today in Nauvoo. In 1994, a concern was raised that it was possible that Hyrum and Joseph's remains were misidentified. So, 14 years later, the author of this paper I am sharing with you undertook an in-depth analysis of the photographs, death masks, and anatomical facts to determine whose remains were whose. After the deaths of Joseph and Hyrum, masks were made. Also, in 1840, when he was in Philadelphia visiting President Martin Van Buren, Joseph had his head measured by a phrenologist. Phrenology is a pseudoscience that involves measuring the bumps of the skull to predict mental traits. These measurement cards were available, so these measurements could be compared to the skulls. Using knowledge of average tissue depths, the death masks, and skull photos, each skull was able to be compared to what was known about Hyrum and Joseph. Comparing the first skull to Joseph, it was found that the tissue depths were too deep, and the depth of the nasal bones was too large. They also didn't correspond to the phrenology measurements that were taken in 1840. However, there was good correspondence to Hyrum. Just to be sure, the second skull was analyzed, comparing tissue depths, skull measurements, and the death mask. The second skull had a good correspondence to Joseph, even though the face had collapsed. Based on that evidence, it was concluded that the remains had not been misidentified. The first skull was correctly identified as Hyrum's, and the second was in fact Joseph's. So, as of 1928, Joseph and Hyrum had not been resurrected, notwithstanding their graves being greatly disturbed. Now, I guess it's curious that the remains of a nameless Nephite or Lamanite girl could be resurrected, but the prophet of the restoration would not be. As my faith was unraveling, I was grasping at whatever I could to try to make the church true. I was desperate, but in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, bit by bit, everything crumbled. The Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, the restoration of the priesthood keys, and even the possibility of the resurrection of Joseph Smith. As I was reading this study, I was at once fascinated on the one hand, and on the other, dying inside as I felt the sinking feeling of my world falling apart. A feeling that people who have experienced the faith crisis can relate to, especially the existential dread that is introduced. But what are your thoughts? What were some things that you tried to grasp onto as your faith crumbled? For any believers, what are your thoughts on this study? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like what I do, please press the like button and subscribe and leave a comment. And I'll see you in the next video.